pick up where we left off yesterday, talking about, just started the chapter on the media. Last slide we were actually talking about was the filtering process that the media has to put into place to identify news. And we talked about these different kind of standards that they use, right? Will this information make an impact? Does it show violence? Is it familiar to the audience? How close is it to the audience, right? How recent is it? All of these are things that every story that a news organization is going to be working through would subject a potential story to see if they would clarify it as news. To get a little more specific on other processes that impact the news, we can look at where news comes from, which is kind of surprising. In this sense, we're talking about, of course, the media dealing with government and policy and politics, and so where specifically does most of the information that becomes news about the government come from, about politics come from? And this may be surprising, maybe not surprising answer to that question is most of the information about government comes from government. So, right, it's either coming from people in government that are wanting to release a story to be, information to be relayed to the people watching, listening, reading the news, or it is possibly released by opposition in government that is wanting to, bring out a different aspect of the story or subject a story, a policy to some criticism, right? And so most of the information that we get about the government actually is generated by the government. So that's kind of interesting, and it's kind of worrisome because what it's telling you is that if we didn't have folks in government whose job was to tell the narrative or explore a narrative or to surreptitiously release information, there's a lot of stuff we wouldn't know. So, we hear people talking about, oh, this story was leaked, or this story came out from anonymous sources, or the government released today, the president said today, or the Congress said today, or right. So when we dig down into all of that, right, they're all government sources in one form or fashion. So most of what the news, wherever it's reporting it, is reporting it from information that was given to them from the government itself. Now, if you remember, though, when we first started talking about the roles of the media, right, that informational role was the first one, and that's what we're talking about here. If we move to the second and third role, which is communication and the watchdog function, then you get into an area where we start to see some independently developed information, right? Information that's not from the government per se. Communication, of course, we're talking earlier about last time, about that encompassing political polling and people talking to the news about what they want and what policy they think is appropriate. So that's generated news about the opinions of the people and what they want is coming from them themselves, and then that information can be wrapped up and presented as news, in which the government does actually might pay attention to. And that third one, the watchdog role, remember, was the media performing an investigative function, right? Telling us, hey, something's going on here, and then they actually do work in the background to develop sources, develop leads, bring up information and evidence. So sometimes other news organizations or news organizations themselves are creating the news that they are reporting, especially if it's a watchdog function. But again, that's not the majority of the information. That's not most of it, right? It's really just some of it, maybe 15% or so. I would hazard a guess somewhere to 80-85% of the information that we get concerning government comes from government itself in one of its own forms, which doesn't necessarily make it right good information or accurate information. It's just information, right? And so we have to submit it to the same kind of critical analysis and concerns about accuracy and truth, and we would information that comes from anywhere else, right? So, but that's generally where news from our government about our government comes from, right? And all of them fit within those three roles that we talked about last time. That the role of the media, right, is digging that out and presenting it as one of those three things. So knowing that, right, this was one of the figures that's in your book, and I took it out of there, right, and it's got a little bit of a different perspective in the sense that this is not where does the actual information come from, but where do we as consumers of the information, where do we get it from? So this is kind of a breakdown based on three generations, right? Demographic generations, and where they tend to get their information. And it's dated. This is from 2014. It's changed an awful lot since then. Facebook is not probably the millennials' home base for information anymore. And I would hazard a guess that baby boomers are probably more there than this shows. But if you look at it, you can see that a good portion of our main news organizations do provide the bulk of the information that people rely on, right? So you've got the BBC and CBS and CNN and Fox. So those are out there providing information through cable news and the regular news networks. Then radio, you've got NPR and Rush Limbaugh, right? Newspapers really only, they not a, the Wall Street Journal is there. A lot of us pay some attention to local newspapers, maybe the New York Times if we're looking for a national, or the Washington Post or something like that, or a national newspaper. But most of us, if we were using newspapers, are probably getting ones that are closer to home. But you notice how those numbers drop off, right? I mean, you look at the Wall Street Journal there, and it's hovered around 10% for each of these generations, right? So we get a lot of information, right, off the internet. YouTube, Twitter, right, Facebook are all there, and then there are tons and tons of news apps out there that can curate and deliver news to you as you want it, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? You see there that a lot of all three of the generations, a lot of them are both looking for traditional media delivery and some internet delivery of their information. But it's kind of an interesting look at where we source our information from. Is there anything up here or not up here where you think folks are getting information from that's not showing on this chart? Reddit. Yeah, Reddit could definitely be a good source of information if you get the right channels, right? Those that they aggregate a lot of information for us, and you just got to go out there and get at it. Interesting thing here is that this is from 14, so this is well before Trump, and so I wonder how much Twitter has grown as an information delivery, right, system in that sense, because right? Trump's on it every day, and so you get a direct pipeline to the president, right, through Twitter. Yeah, Colton, I think a lot of us, I say a lot of us, the newspapers are hurting, but there are a good number of us that are in local areas that subscribe to a newspaper or get the online version of the local newspaper. They're trying very hard to keep themselves relevant right now. A lot of newspapers local newspapers have gone out of business. A lot of them have combined with other newspapers. I think that's slowly a dying form of media, as I think we're going to see maybe a few of the big national newspapers will still be right out there. The Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times, maybe the Houston Chronicle or something like that. But I think a lot of the smaller papers, including ones like Austin, may not be around long in the print format. Right? They may just have to move over to digital only if they're going to make it. And that's not a good thing for local information or for statewide information, right? Those are the places that we can get some in-depth work on that. Now, if you're interested in local information, a really good resource for what's going on in politics in Texas is the Texas Tribune, which is an online resource that's puts itself out there as nonpartisan. It's supported by by subscription and by donations, and you look at the donors list, it goes across the political spectrum, which means they think they're getting pretty good service out of that. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for just local information, especially Texas politics, go to the Texas Tribune. I think it's a pretty good resource. So as we're talking about where you get your news, right? I mean, this is not looking at bias. This is just looking at delivery modes, right? I mean, where the channels are. So we'll talk a little bit about bias as we move on today too, and where a lot of these sit on the left-right spectrum. What I want to spend a little bit of time with now is discussing media from a different perspective. We look at it from the political science roles of what it does for us in our institutions and for information. But I think for us to really understand how media is working, and we need to understand what drives it. And there is more than just the information role there, right? In the last 30 years, 40 years now, the media has taken a sharp turn from delivering a public service to delivering a profit-making product. So the background focus from the ownerships of big media corporations is not just what do we put out there that's going to be useful, but what do we put out there that's going to sell? And so understanding news today, you have to understand the business motivation behind it that's driving it, which is different than it used to be. And it's another one of those filters, right? The business filter, the profit-making filter is here now. When news is trying to determine what to put on, right? It's having to look at what's going to sell, what's going to grab eyes, what's a good story, what's sensational, right? So this used to be the case. If you go far enough back in time, in the 60s and 70s, the news as an information source was viewed by the owners as a public service announcement, as something that they weren't trying to make a profit off of, but they were doing because as part of the organization using the public airwaves, they needed to provide public service back to the folks that were watching it. And so in that sense, right, they were viewing the news really as if you know this term as a loss, right? Loss leaders when a business is selling something at or below cost, because right, they're either trying to bring people in with that and get them to buy something else, or because they know that this is something that the society needs and they're going to, in a sense, provide a public service. And so you go back to the Walter Cronkite era, you're looking at the news from a perspective of a public service. But that's all changed, right? That's all changed. And so now there's actual competition between the news media to deliver news that sells and makes a profit. And so that's what they do, right? Part of that process has resulted in an immense concentration of the news into just a few major companies, and even this is now out of date some. So, but like, again, as I said, started in the 80s, right? When there became a focus on news as a profit-making source, we went from a large number of wide-ranging media companies delivering information to us to over the past 30 years, right, to just a few, right, just a few major companies. Now, some of those companies are much more stringent about how they want their news put together, and provided some have let some others move as they want to, right? Let the news kind of cover it, design itself. But the fact is that the overreaching corporate offices now are huge, and there's only a few of them, and so our opportunity to get different news from a different angle has collapsed a lot. The other thing that came out of this focus on profit was an actual, not just the concentration, but an actual move toward intentional bias on the delivery of that news. When you're not trying to sell a product, you're doing something as a public service. You're taking the information and you're probably not putting a lot of effort into coloring it or blending it or moving it or augmenting it. You're just telling the story, right? You're giving out the information. But when you start to put a profit motive behind a news organization, now you start looking at, right, the audience not as people seeking information, but as customers. And you start looking at your product as something that's going to deliver eyes to advertising. Right? It's going to keep you want to keep people focused on your product so that when you advertise, they're watching it. So essentially, what we saw happen is, right, we saw in the late 70s or so, in that area, we started seeing there being a common refrain from 14 to 18% of the American population that our media was leftist in its political bias, that the media was liberal, not conservative. And that is certainly, like I said, about 14 to 18% of the population was saying that. At the same time, have always been doing, since the 60s, ideological bias testing on the news media and the stories they put out there. And so we had research showing us that it wasn't necessarily true that the media stories that were being put out were had a leftist slant to them. They were pretty much in the center of where the population was as far as ideology was concerned. That's not to say that 14 to 18% didn't view them that way, though, that they were biased. And they did. And those 14 to 18% of the American population were conservative, right-leaning, consumers of the news who saw themselves as centrist or in the middle. They weren't, but that's how they perceived themselves. So for a period of time, we've got this percentage of folks that are telling us the news is liberal, the news is leftist, the news is bad. It's not actually giving us a true on-point story. And at the same time, you've got a new media mogul trying to make a splash in the United States market, and that was Rupert Murdoch. And so Rupert Murdoch is seeing this assertion from 14 to 18% of the people that the media is to the left of center. And what he figured out was that he only needed, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 14% of news consuming populace to turn a profit with the business. And so he understood that if he generated a media organization that catered right of center and could capture from the center out to the right, he'd have a profit-making enterprise. And that's exactly what he did. And so Rupert Murdoch brought in, cable news network Fox, and generated Fox News with an intentional right of center bias. And he absolutely captured 14 to 16% of that 18% market. And they turned a profit. This was an intentional business decision, right, from Rupert Murdoch and what he developed as Fox News, right, and the Fox network. Prior to that, right, we'd had our first real media delivery of news was really coming from just one place, and that was CNN. And as far as delivery of news on the internet, right, through cable TV. The rest were ABC, CBS, and NBC, and they were on your broadcast, public broadcast airwaves. And CNN was kind of the main, cable network outlet for news. All of our studies from that time show that CNN was pretty much, center as far as their ideological bias. Their big selling point, it was news 24/7, which was something new and different, right? And then they get a competitor in Fox. It's moving to the right. And so they're trying to now redefine themselves in relationship to this competition. Even more so was NBC. NBC saw Fox come in, grab up and lock down 14% of the viewing public through cable news, and realized that there was, right, a whole area that they could occupy. Again, those of us actually doing research in this area saw that our news stories were actually mostly centrist, right? It wasn't, and then Fox started moving to the right. But MSNBC said, well, if there's room on the right, then there's room on the left. And so MSNBC came in and defined themselves to the left side of the ideological spectrum in the way they deliver news. And so we actually see, right, the cable media starting to drive intentional ideological bias into the delivery of the news, right? Now you still have ABC, CBS, NBC, trying to kind of sell to everybody, right? But we're watching the market, right, split up between these different competitors, and it's when you're trying to corner a part of the market, you go out and you do your research and you find out what that part of the market wants, and then you package your product to sell to them. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now, especially in the cable news area, right? The delivery through the cable companies, which is why this consolidation is such a big deal, right? Because now you have media delivery companies along with media creation, and they're pairing up, right, and becoming these large organizations to provide information out there from a perspective. And that's a wholesale change in the news media landscape. Does this make sense? Any questions? So the other thing that's going on here, right? We've got the design of these companies coming in and putting bias in on the ideological spectrum. We've got a business bias coming in that's trying to sell, let's make a product that sells, not just information. We've got the filtering that goes on about how do you figure out what is news. There's yet another element on this, and it's how do you actually prepare the news, right? And that in and of itself has a different slant of bias that comes in, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Again, if you go back to the 60s and early 70s, even the 50s, you'll see news presented in a very common format that we call the talking head format, which is kind of what you're seeing right here, right? If you can, me, right, in front of a camera, here's the information, here's what happened today, right? And here's what you need to know. And think of historically people like Walter Cronkite, right, and how they delivered the news. It was just them, their notes, camera, maybe some background graphics every now and then, but it was pretty much my job here is to inform you. That's a talking head kind of perspective, right? But talking head perspective is not as engaging as what we've moved to now, which is a point counterpoint kind of formatting for how we organize a news program. Now, if you pay attention to how the news is put together, especially in a visual format, we have the point counterpoint, which might have one or two people as newscasters, right, reading you the story, bringing up the graphics, telling you a little bit about what's going on, but then they pitch it off to commentary, right, to people who are not newscasters, but are a liberal or a conservative, a Democrat or a Republican, a politician from one party and then from the other party, and they have them in a sense tease out the bias from each position, right, and lay out an argument for us why this way or that way, or that's not true, and this is what's really the case, and you should view it like this. So the point counterpoint perspective in formatting news is to kind of present the news from a perspective of competition, of game playing in a sense, right? Who's going to make a better point? Who's going to come out on top? And so when you're doing that, it kind of takes the focus off of accuracy and puts it more on sensationalism or delivery, and who wins the jousting, right, between the two, the point and the counterpoint folks. And the newscaster is there as kind of a mediator, maybe. They introduce the topic, they bring in the information, and then they introduce the competitors. So it's a much different way of organizing the presentation of especially visual news, right? But it's done because it's more sensational, it's more interesting, right? It's not just somebody's telling us something. Yes, the pundits, exactly, Colton. That's a great word for it. The pundits, right, that they bring in to talk about things. They don't need pundits to give you the information, right? The news organizations can give you the information. They bring them on to give you the entertainment value, right? So you wonder why an MSNBC brings on a conservative or a Fox brings on a liberal. It's because they need that conflict, right? They're looking for it. They're looking for that combativeness on each side of a policy issue or something that happened. And that's only there, right, as an entertainment factor, a sensationalism factor. So that's something that's changed, right? How we present the news, and I think it's probably not necessarily for the best, right? Because it maybe has us focused more on the game between the parties or between positions or policy than it does on what does the country need and how can we get there and what happened today. Imagine if, right, the whole COVID situation, when we went to the news media, whether it was online or TV or whatever, they were telling us, okay, here's what the health authorities say you need to do. And this is why this is important. So go out there and do this. And they stopped at that point, as opposed to bringing on somebody that wanted to talk about whether wearing a mask infringed on their freedom or was too much of a, government was overstepping their boundaries, or right, the folks that are pushing this mask wearing are only doing it to damage the politicians that are in government today, right? I mean, just goes off a lot of different directions that take you away from the, hey, to deal with the COVID, the health experts think you should do 1, 2, 3, right? They politicized, right, the health information. Does that make it more interesting? Does it make it more palatable? It doesn't make it more palatable, but it does probably make it a little more interesting. It also ramps up fear and possibly misinformation. So this point counterpoint is not necessarily a good thing. It might get more eyes on the information. So in that perspective, that's a good thing. But then, if it does it and it does it at the expense of truth and what we know, then that's a problem. Another large occurrence, right, that's been ongoing in the media and how they present the news is a drastic compression of stories from, right, a minute or a minute and a half, 2 minutes to much less. And that's a problem, right? I mean, you think about it, if you're watching the news, right, the news is on for 35 minutes. And what are they going to tell you? Are they going to focus on the national news? Are they going to focus on local news? Is there anything else that's going to be there besides news? Yeah, there's going to be weather and sports and maybe some human interest stories, and then national news and state news and local news maybe. And you're going to do all of these things in a 35 minute window, and in that 35 minute window or so is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 minutes of advertising. So now you're down to 23 minutes, right, to do all of those same things. And when you sit down and kind of chart out where you're going to do this, right, especially if it's like you're watching a local news station, there are some things on there that are non-negotiable, right? In-depth weather, right? Local sports, right? If they don't cover those right locally, they're going to lose viewers even faster, right? They've got to have that. And so, in a sense, the news, the information part of it, is second or third tier for what's going to be delivered, and it gets compressed. And if you start doing a little bit of clock watching, you'll notice that the real information part of the news is, 6 minutes, maybe. Well, if you're going to do 6 minutes, let's be generous and say 8 minutes, right, of news. What happens when you got a news day with 7 stories or 8 stories? Right? You've got to do an introduction to the topic. You've got to play some videos, some graphics, right? You got to talk about it to bring enough in the sense, and then you get a counterpoint situation. You do that 6 or 7 times, and that's it. That's all the stories you got. right? And you're up against it. And so if you're going to split that out, say a local news station, they're going to have 7 to 8 stories, and they want to do some local news and some state news and some federal news and maybe some international news. That's 1 or 2 stories per category. We're not getting a lot of information that's out there, right? That's why some of us go to online news and the newspapers, because they're not constrained by the time frame, right, of delivering the news. So those of us that would, right, subsist on news through ABC, NBC, whatever, right, over the airwaves news or Fox or NBC, you're going to run into some timing issues where you've got more information than you actually have time to put out there. And even if your story is selected important enough to get out there, you're only going to get a minute or less to talk about it, right? Now that's a place where Fox News and MSNBC News and CNN News and right, they fill a void there, because as far as if you're wanting to watch the delivery of your news, you can go to those on cable networks, and they run right over and over and longer, and so you can find it there. That's why a lot of people did start going there, right? So formatting is important. Recognizing the constraints of actually delivering a news program and what all information is going to have to be selected, how much more information is going to be pushed to the side, right, is important. The last little bit of presenting the news that we want to talk about is, and ways it's done, is through presentation. Right? Once you've decided what the news is, once you've decided that it is going to make the show, right? You've decided how long you have to present it. Then you got to decide, well, what's the overarching focus of a news story? Right? Is this news story something that is happening across the nation or across the state? Is it something that we can see here, and here, and that the fact that it's happening in all those places means we need to pay attention to it? If that's the case, then you're starting to put together a story that's thematic in its design. Right? And when you do something from that perspective, you're saying, look, here's one problem, and it's happening in society in all of these places, right? You're not focused on each of the individual places so much. You're focused on this common problem in society. And so it's a theme. And you're using the number of times that you can point at it happening out there as a reinforcement that it's important. And it's something that ought to have the focus of the government. So that's one way to go about delivering it, is to say, this is an overarching problem. Like, so if we're going to talk about COVID, we would do it that way, or income distribution that way, or job loss, we'd do it that way, right? And we'd have stories for, see, Texas has a job loss of this percentage, and it's affecting their economy this way, but California is worse or better, blah. You'd have all these comparisons. But what you're bringing out is the common theme, right, that runs in all those stories. So that's another kind of presentation bias that we have to be aware of. Within that is a different one, which is called episodic presentation, which is where you're going to take a singular example and maybe dive a little deeper on it and focus on an individual and tell us what's going on here and why this is a problem and how government ought to be addressing this issue right here now, which is a very different way than saying this. Here, let me describe the issue, and here's all the places it happens. Here's a story now that's going to be, here's this issue, and we're going to dive down into the particulars enough that we're going to try to make you feel it, right? We're going to drive this story toward your feelings and your perceptions and try to get you invested, right, in this individual and their story. Both of these are different, right? I mean, One's giving you a pervasiveness of a problem, the other is giving you the singular and discrete kind of focus on a problem. But the presentation is going to be very different, and it works for some of us and doesn't work for others. But all of this is part of different types of bias, right, that the news brings in that we really don't think about. Right? Most of the time, we say, oh, the news is biased, and we're only talking about a ideological spectrum issue, right, between liberals and conservatives, and where the news falls on that, and what political message they're preaching. But there's a whole lot more going on, organizing these messages, organizing these stories, putting it out there for us to consume, than most of us pay attention to. Questions on that? All right, so is there bias in the news? The answer is yes, but it's not just the one way you think it is, right? I've kind of already said this. Most of our media stories are actually pretty centrist, especially prior to Fox and MSNBC. If you go to your ABC, CBS, NBC, your main deliverer of video news, still really right around the center as far as what they're doing. The cable news networks definitely sliding off into different corners of the ideological spectrum. Major national newspapers, right? Some bias here and there. You know, if you're a reader of the Wall Street Journal, you're getting a paper that leans right of center. If you're reading the New York Times, it leans left of center, right? They're not hugely ideologically biased, but they are some, right? You know, some of the news organizations that you look at on the internet are going to show you ideological bias. Actually, I've got a nice slide that I pulled off that I will pop up here for you. So there's a website out there called All Sides. And it's an interesting kind of website because what it tries to do is, in one place, give you all of the stories from all the different ideological perspectives. So it gets one story and it tells you, here are the other stories that are out there on the same topic today. And it tells you where the bias is. So they've actually, right, from going through this and looking at online content that's provided from news organizations, again, not what's broadcast over there, but their online content. They've come up with this chart that they think is a pretty good reflection on ideological perspective, right? And so, right, what you're seeing here is 5 columns that move from left ideological bias, left leaning, center bias, right leaning, and right bias. And so you can look on here and find your own, if any of these are your online content that you use, you can see where it kind of falls in the silos. C-SPAN is really, it's not much of anything going on there as far as commentary in the sense, or just you know, fact reading. And so in that sense, I mean, most of the time, you're getting C-SPAN, you're getting a camera on what's going on. So these are ones that are going to give you explanations of stories, right? Interviews of the folks. There's some of that on C-SPAN, but not so much, right? So if you look down here, I'm sorry, I didn't get the everyone bit, but okay. So if you look down here down the center, right, these are ones that they say is, you know, they're not too bad, right? These are ones that if you're reading them, you're probably not that they're perfectly in the center, but on average, right? And then, right now, and you've got to pay attention to the little parts out here like this that say the news only, right? New York Times, news only. If you go look at the New York Times opinion, it goes from left center to left, right? If you look at the news in the Wall Street Journal, it's center, but if you look at their opinion, it goes right leaning, right? So, you got to pay attention to this. I mean, you get ones like Newsmax and New York Post that are right leaning in their news and just far right as far as their opinion stuff goes, right? Notice the distinction between Fox News and Fox Opinion, right? CNN News and CNN Opinion. So this is something that we need to be aware of, especially when we're talking to people and somebody says, well, CNN is this leftist communist, right? Well, there's some truth to that because the CNN opinion stuff is right, easily identifiable on the far left. But their news is closer to center than you tend to think it is, right? Here's ABC, here's CBS, here's NBC. Notice that they're all leaning left. That has happened not so much because they've changed the way they do their business and how they report it, as it is that we've had a bigger part of the society move to the right. They haven't moved so much as a good portion of us have moved away from them. So the center has moved to the right, and they're left where they were, which used to be the center. But we don't see it that way as right when people are talking, because when people are talking about themselves, generally they see themselves in the center and they define things around themselves, right? And so you got to keep that in mind when you're talking to people and people are telling you that this is right this way or this is this way. They're probably only defining it from their side of things. When a chart like this is built, what you do is you sit down and you do content analysis of story after story after story after story right over a period of time, so that you build an index of where that is. That doesn't mean that a BBC is always in the center, but it means it tends to the center more than it tends to the right or the left, right? Notice here, if you talk to people about NPR, right? NPR is always seen as far left. Their opinion is actually left of center, but their news, right, is pretty much just here's what happened today, right? And they're very clear about when they go off on, a tangent about, opining on a topic or something like that. So I like to use, actually, I know it was on here somewhere, but I don't see it now. There it is, Reuters. I have an app that I use that is Reuters, which Reuters is one of the worldwide collectors of news stories around the world, and they're like the AP and the UPI, and AP being here, and I don't think I've even seen the UPI on here anymore. I think they've kind of merged. Associated Press is, again, focused on getting information out there, not focused on packaging it up real pretty and delivering it at 6 p.m. So you can count on AP and Reuters and stuff to give you stuff that's kind of still 1960-ish, in the sense that here's the facts and just the facts. Here's what we know, right? And so it's not as entertaining, but it's more information driven. The further away from the center you get, the more information the more entertaining you're gonna find it around the information. You may still find, right, the same information in a HuffPost article that you find in an Economist article, that you find in BBC article. The actual facts may be presented the same all the way across the spectrum. It's the dressing they put around it and the way they talk about it that's going to move the story to one side or the other. The basic facts are facts. They don't. There's not a spin on it, right, until you start talking about the facts and talking about how you interpret those facts and what they mean. That's when you watch for the spin. So I used to do some of this content analysis. It's really kind of boring work, but the results are interesting, right? So I think the all sides, if you ever want to go to a website and see some interesting presentation of the news, right? They do a good job of showing the perspective, I'll call it, instead of bias, that is brought out in the different news stories. And you can sit there and read the same story, 2 or 3 times based upon who's published it, and see the different way that they present it. And I think it's kind of enlightening, right? And I think it's just, if I remember right, it's just allsides.com. I'll go check real quick. Helps to use the right keyboard. Let me just. So this is what it looks like. So when you come in here, so here's a story about the Facebook, Twitter, and Google CEOs talking to the Senate Commerce today. And you'll see, so here's the main story, and then here's how it's presented, right? From the right, from the left, and from the center, right? And so you can compare how it's written up. And if you look down here, right, you see it's left leaning, it's right leaning. And so you can look at some of that, right, and compare how it's written. I think that's kind of interesting sometimes, right? And so you can come up here and look at different topics, right? If you want to see coronavirus stuff. And, well, here's one: is Texas a swing state? That's kind of right. And so you're going to see different ways of talking about it, right? Notice here they've got the Texas Tribune, who I just recommended to you, is not that biased, showing them as left center. So maybe I'm not as center as I think I am, if they're better at this than I am. So anyway, I think it's a good resource. I think it's kind of interesting, and it lets you do some of this analysis on bias in the news and see it, right? All right, let's get back to the presentation part of it. So, yes, there's bias. There's all kinds of bias, right? There's bias to the way we package the news. There's bias to the way we identify what's news. There's bias to the way we talk about it once we get it out there, and how we explain the story. So there's a lot of different things going on that are, I think, as interesting and maybe as important as what we tend to focus on, which is ideological bias. So as you can see, there's some drama, right? Some photos, right? That's another thing, right? If you go back in time, it used to be, right, again, the talking head, and then we started getting black and white video, and then we started getting color video, and now we have, right, if we have something going on, right, if you can get live video, right, all of that's the entertainment aspect, right? It ramps up the angst and the drama and the tension, and that's entertaining. What are you going to do to deliver an engaging story about the U.S. budget? Right? Not much. So that's a bit of an issue, right? So this is taking that ideological bias, right, and showing you how it worked itself out through the 2012 election. Again, not really recent, but it's still accurate, right? And there's, you look at this, and they're looking at three of the online delivery places of the news and how they delivered their story is so that you can see bias. And so if you look at CNN there, you see when CNN's talking about Obama, they are critical of Obama a little more than they are positive about him when they were talking about him. Right? So you wouldn't say in that sense, looking at just that they were actually pro-Obama. They actually criticized him more than they praised him. But if you look at Romney, right, and look at the negative tones and positive tones in their stories, they were negative about him a lot more and positive a lot less. And so when you put those two things together from CNN, right, they're left-leaning, certainly, right? Even though they criticize everybody, right, their positive spin is definitely on the left side of things, right? They do have some positive stuff, right? They're not completely ignoring that Romney had some good things going on, but 3 out of 4 times, not so much. Now realize, right, this is only for Romney, this is 40%, right? Or so of the story, 45% of the story, something like that. So there's a lot of bias neutral stuff. The majority of the stories are bias neutral, right? But we're not interested in those. Right? We're wanting to look at the bias part of it. And that's the other thing that we as viewers tend to ignore, right? When what we're seeing agrees with our own perception or doesn't offend our perception, we agree with it or we just ignore it. It's only when it confronts us, right, when it's contrary to what we want to see or think, that it starts to register. And that doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that's when we're paying attention to it. Look at MSNBC. This is one of my favorites. When they were talking about Obama, 39% of the time, right? Good stuff. So the stories they chose about him, almost 4 out of 10 were positive. Only 15% had a negative tone. So you've got, 40, what is that? That's 55%, yeah. So 45% of the time they had some neutral stories. So they almost had as many positive stories as neutral stories. And only 15% of the time were they saying something negative about Obama. Couple that with 7 out of 10 stories being negative in tone about Romney. And it's really, really easy for the viewer to go, this is a leftist, presentation. This is definitely on the left side of the ideological bias. You go over to Fox, you see not as bad, but the inverse of MSNBC, or more so than CNN, less so than MSNBC, but at that positive shifts, right? You have a lot more positive for Romney, almost no positive, 6% to Obama, but 46% negative, right? So they're a little more fair in a sense than MSNBC is, but CNN kind of does better than both of them, right? So this is another way just to recognize what's going on is how you categorize these stories and whether they're positive, neutral, or negative. And that's something that the organizations choose, right? So that gives us a good kind of perspective of what's going on there. This makes sense? All right, so our last slide in this media area is about what is the actual media, how they influence us. And we've got 4 places that we can look for influence from the media. In other words, where it can impact us as an audience. We don't think about it much, but it's kind of interesting, right? So the first one is, and this is probably the biggest one when you think about it, is they set our agenda about what we're thinking about. So in other words, you decide to go read the news, right? Watch the news, listen to the news or something. You might have heard something in your day that says, "Oh, this is probably going to be a news story tonight," but maybe not. Maybe you're sitting down to engage, right, the news, and you're just like, "What happened today? I need to know what happened today." Well, they're going to set the agenda of what you think about by the stories they talk about, right? Once they go through and say these are the big stories of the day, and they give you some information about that stories and some videos and some vitals and some discussion, that's what you're going to be thinking about now, because that's what you got information on. There may be other things that have happened out there, but you don't know about them. So the fact that they put together a list of stories to give to you primes you, in other words, sets you up to think about those stories and not to think about other things that may have happened. We're not even aware maybe of what else has happened. So the media certainly influences what we think about because they're providing the information that we become aware of, that we get introduced to. And, you may not even, unless someone gives you a story, right, you don't know that it's out there a lot of times. And so that's a huge influence, right? Notice here, they're not telling you to think necessarily a certain way about it. They're just saying, because they've chosen this story and they've presented this story, that's now what you have information to think about. And so that's what you will think about if you think about the information, the news at all. So that's really key, right? The second thing is that they we set the agenda, now we're going to prime. Setting the agenda gave us those topics to talk about. Now they're going to give us the talking points about those topics. And this is priming us to discuss or think or talk about the story they presented to us, right? So they choose the story, and then they say, this is why this story is important. Here are some things to think about. And if we're looking at that, and that makes sense to us, right, that is what we will think about, right? That will be the points that we tend to gravitate to because it's right there, right? That's the whole point of like a PowerPoint slide deck, right? It primes me, the lecturer, to talk about things, right? By putting it in front of me. I'm sorry, Andrea, I just saw your question. So does this mean that the media manipulates us? Yes, absolutely. Now, is that manipulation meant to be nefarious or leading? That's going a little further, right? The media, in the best of circumstances, is looking at all of the information going, we're going to be able to talk about 6 things tonight. In our, right, professional opinion as journalists looking at government, these are the 6 biggest things you need to know. Does that manipulate you? Yes, but not in a bad way, right? They may be absolutely right, and they may have picked out these 6 biggest things that they have time to talk about. That means number 7, which might be very important, but is not as important as the other 6, is left off the list. And because they've set the agenda and now given you information about the issues they talked about on that agenda, you've been manipulated to think and talk about those same things. Now, and this is certainly possible, but I don't know that you're going to see it happen very often, if at all. If there was something big and important that you needed to know about, and they said, "Oh, we're not going to cover that because, right, we don't want America thinking about that. That's bad for our president, or it's bad for whatever." That's manipulation also. That intentional withholding of information, or the intentional deep coloring of information to a particular perspective. But they've got to be careful about that, because remember that business bias that underlies this. People will turn off, right, if they think information sources they think are being dishonest with them. They'll go somewhere else. And so there's kind of a reinforcement mechanism here that they stay close enough to the facts that people believe they're right giving them what they need. So the manipulation is not probably going to be, let's make this propaganda and get people to believe X, even though that's not true. It's not from the news media. It might be from the opinion folks, as much as it's going to be, here's the information they need. Let's talk about the main points of it, right? So here's the topics, here's the talking points, right? The setting of the agenda and the priming. Does that make sense? So, very good question. There are organizations, news gathering organizations out there, and I don't think they're the prime ones in this sense. But there are some, and they're getting there, who deliver their news from their perspective, not from like Fox did from a profit-making perspective, right? But are now to the point of, let's deliver leftist news and let's deliver rightist news. And I can back up here real quick. Actually, I don't know if this had it or not on that. I don't know. Let me see if I can find that. So this group right here, OAN, definitely coming at you with a bias, right? Definitely trying to get you hyper nationalist, hyper conservative, and Mother Jones, right? Well-known progressive organization, or Huffington Post, right? Hardcore limousine liberal Northeast perspective, right? They're going to give you a dose, right, of their politics, right? So their bias. So some of these are definitely doing that. Daily Wire, the Blaze, right? These are driven by media personalities, and they know that you're buying a perspective that has some news to it. There's a news organization out there that's been buying up, a distribution company that's been buying up local television stations, right? It's called Sinclair Broadcasting. And the folks that own Sinclair Broadcasting are very much upfront that they are very conservative, and that the information presented over their broadcasting networks are going to go that direction. And so there is that happening out there, right? And it might surprise you at how big they are and how far they've grown, right? But they are not at all concerned about where they are on the spectrum. They're going to tell you what they want to do, right, and what they believe. And I just looked them up here. Sinclair Broadcast Group has 190 television stations in 88 U.S. markets. And right? They are very much on the right-hand side of the ideological spectrum. So, if that's what you want, they're out there for you, right? And that is happening, right? For Fox, as right-leaning as they are, you're going to find that to be mostly their opinion stuff and mostly their news-oriented talk shows. When you get to their just Fox Nightly News, right, as the chart here shows us, right, it's right here in the center, right here, just right center. That's not so much, right? So you got to look at it that way. But these over here, right, OAN, Slate, Fox, these aren't their opinion parts. This is their news, right? So they're coming at you with some bias intentionally. So back to the areas of where media influences, where they actually have an impact, right? They set the agenda by picking the stories, and that's what we're going to talk about. They give us the talking points, so they prime us about those stories, about how to talk to them. And that's somewhat based on us, how we're going to be primed, because we pick, right, the stations that we like, the talking points that we hear, right? Another place that they're going to be having influence on us is how they talk about them. Not just what it is that's the talking points, but how they cover those talking points. And we're seeing a lot of this right now, which is called talking about the political game, where they're talking about winners and losers. They're talking about who's up in the polls, who's down in the polls. They're talking about this happened today. How does it affect the political game and who's winning and who's losing? And they talk about it that way so much that we tend to, right, think of it in those terms quite often when you don't have to, right? We don't have to think about, is this a Democratic story or a Republican story, a conservative story or a liberal story, and who's coming out because of this situation. We could think about it from how does this affect me? How does this affect the country? Is this where the country needs to go long-term based upon some other value, right? Democracy or truth or justice or anything besides the political game, right? Because the media knows that talking about the political game is more exciting, right? There's winners and losers, there's competition, that keeps them eyes on them, people thinking about them. It's an easily deliverable metaphor people can buy into. And so then when we do start to talk about the elements of the story and what's important, we do it about who it advantages or who it disadvantages and who's winning and who's losing. It's an influence we don't even think about, right? Which is just, that's the way it's in front of us and it makes sense and we're used to it and we go with it. And finally, we have an influence coming from the media that goes to how we feel about something. The delivery of the information is one thing, but the way you categorize it, the way you surround it with video and interviews, is going to color the way people feel about what they're seeing, right? If it's a human interest story, right, it's going to be kind of uplifting. If it's a redemption story, right, in politics, you might like it. If it's a fall from grace story, you might feel, some sympathy or, right, some loathing even, right? It's just, here's somebody that had it all and they were stupid and did this. And can you believe, right? I mean, so the way they present that story and editorialize around it impacts how we feel about the situation. Part of that's still bundled in with the perspective that they're bringing to it from the ideological spectrum, right? If you're on Fox News, you're going to get a story that's, say, something bad has gone on with the president. You're going to get a lot more sympathetic delivery of that information that's bad for the president than you might over at Msnbc. There might be a little Machiavellian glee, right, in the delivery of a story that's gone bad for the president, right? Maybe a little Schadenfreude or something, right? So, I mean, think about when President Trump got COVID, right? The way the news was delivered in different ways about that elicited different feelings from the viewers, right? Oh no, the president's got COVID. To look, the president's got COVID, right? That's well deserved. If you'd have done more, how you deliver that, how you talk about it, right? The folks that are watching it are already expecting you to come and drive an emotional appeal a certain direction because of the show that they're watching.